trauma responses in love and loss, why we shut down, chase, or can't let go. I'm Ben Ufana, and I'm just completing another article here on trauma bonding. And there's so much packed into the 10 pages of this article, more than one can humanly remember. So I will be referring to my article. I will be reading some sections because there's a lot of important information I want to include. So let's dive into it. Most of us have at one point or another found ourselves in relationships where we felt stuck. We couldn't let go of someone, even when we knew that person was hurting us, or we shut down completely, unable to connect or trust or even feel. We chased or withdrew, we collapsed. And these aren't signs of weakness or brokenness, they're trauma responses, deeply rooted in our early life experiences. Trauma isn't just about what happened to us, it's about what happened inside of us when we didn't feel safe, loved, or protected. Trauma responses are deeply ingrained, shaped by overwhelming experiences that become imprinted within the brain. Other parts of the nervous system, the muscles and fascia, the internal organs, the psyche, and subconscious mind. Over time, they become our default responses to stress, conflict, or emotional and physical intimacy. Although these responses may have served a purpose at the time of the traumatic events and other adverse life experiences, they often outlive their usefulness. Once they become habitual and unconscious, they can create deep emotional pain, fueling overwhelming fears of abandonment, reinforcing emotional numbness or avoidance, and keeping others at a distance, and undermining your ability to form healthy, meaningful, and fulfilling connections with others. The four core trauma responses. The fight response is about regaining control, and it often shows up as anger, defensiveness, or the urge to dominate. In childhood, it may have protected you by making it harder for others to hurt you. In adult relationships, it can manifest as conflict, reactivity, or attempts to control others to feel safe. Flight, on the other hand, is the urge to escape. In relationships, it often shows up as emotional avoidance, ghosting, or pulling away when things feel too intense or overwhelming. Freezing happens when parts of your body and mind shut down in response to something that feels overwhelming or unsafe. And this can happen in varying degrees. Sometimes you go numb or dissociate or feel paralyzed or emotionally check out. It often manifests as a feeling of being disconnected from yourself or your partner. Fawning, on the other hand, is the compulsion to appease. And that could take the form of people pleasing, chronic apologizing, self abandonment, and the inability to set boundaries. In relationships, it often means tolerating behaviors that hurt you just to keep the peace or avoid abandonment. For some, this response takes the form of chasing after the person who's hurting them, trying to fix the connection at any cost. It's a way to seek safety by merging with the wishes and demands of others while forfeiting your own needs in the process. Trauma responses aren't failures of emotional intelligence, they're maladaptive coping mechanisms. In many cases, they form because what was happening at the time overwhelmed our capacity to emotionally and neurologically process the experience. In those moments when our system became overwhelmed, the brain and the body defaulted to whatever coping mechanism it was capable of, whether it was shutting down, running, fighting, or appeasing. These weren't conscious choices, they were automatic, unconscious responses or reflexes triggered when something felt too big, too unsafe, or too threatening to process. Over time, these responses become deeply ingrained. And when they persist long after the original threat is gone, They limit our ability to connect, trust, or feel safe in relationships and in the world. Trauma bonds are powerful emotional connections that develop between someone who is abused and the abuser, especially when episodes of abuse are interspersed with moments of tenderness or affection. This isn't just emotional, it's neurological. The drama, intensity, and dysfunction of the relationship generate a chemical cocktail in the brain: oxytocin, bonding, dopamine, reward and craving, cortisol, stress, and adrenaline, survival, and thrill all surge and intertwine to reinforce the connection, along with other neurochemicals that shape our memory, arousal, and attachment patterns. The loving moments create the dopamine high, also eliciting the release of oxytocin, while the volatility triggers a stress response that keeps your nervous system on edge. And over time, your brain becomes conditioned to equate emotional chaos with intimacy and connection. Even when you consciously know the relationship is toxic, the combination of unprocessed emotions, biochemical imprinting, and other aspects of the stress physiology can keep you hooked. The entire system may react intensely to the chaos, but often lacks the tools or internal resources to regulate, process, and respond in a healthier way. Trauma bonds also form because part of us is still hoping for resolution, still trying to get the love, validation, or the safety we didn't receive early on. We unconsciously recreate these dynamics, hoping that this time it will end differently. Trauma bonding doesn't only show up in romantic relationships, it can also occur in parent child dynamics, sibling relationships, and overly controlling religious or cultic groups. Next, we'll talk about the 7 stages of trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is based on manipulation and control and is especially common in relationships with narcissistic and other emotionally unstable individuals. Abusive partners operate in cycles, alternating between cruelty and moments of warmth and affection. That creates confusion, instability, and emotional dependency. In such a heightened state of vulnerability, the one being mistreated begins to equate love with volatility. They cling to the brief moments of connection and tenderness, even when these moments are fleeting and interspersed with criticism, neglect, and emotional and sometimes even physical harm. What emerges is a powerful emotional attachment, one rooted in fear, misplaced loyalty, and an ongoing struggle to make sense of the emotional chaos. Trauma bonds don't occur all at once, they develop in stages. And it often begins with what feels like real love or deep connection, which creates a sense of trust. But over time, the affection starts to give way to criticism, control, and emotional manipulation. The person on the receiving end finds himself hooked, holding out hope that things will go back to how they were in the beginning. This dynamic tends to unfold in a predictable sequence, often moving through these 7 distinct stages. Trauma bonding commonly begins with love bombing, where the abuser showers you with affection, praise, and attention. It feels exhilarating and overwhelming. Next is trust and dependency. You start to rely on the abuser for emotional support, validation, and even basic decision making. And this bond deepens as your lives become more entwined. And over time, that dependency grows. You may begin to pull away from others, making you more vulnerable to manipulation and control. What once felt like connection slowly turns into entanglement, one that's incredibly difficult to break free from. As the connection continues to shift, the abuser begins to criticize, demean, or withdraw affection. What was once praise turns into judgment, and the emotional highs start to vanish, replaced by fear, shame, and confusion. And you find yourself working ever harder to try to regain their approval, not realizing that the goalposts are constantly moving. The longing for connection you once felt only deepens the trauma bond, making it harder to break free. Manipulating and gaslighting often follow. The abuser distorts reality, denies what happens, or blames you for their behavior, and you start to question your memory, your perception, and even your sanity. And over time, this constant erosion of truth wears down your self esteem, leaving you more confused, emotionally dependent, and less likely to challenge the abuse. You begin to rely on them more and more for your sense of what's real. And still, you find yourself pulled even deeper into the trauma bond, often without realizing it's happening. As the trauma bond deepens, you feel worn down and exhausted by the cycles of manipulation and fleeting kindness. You may begin to accept the situation, not because it's okay, but because you feel too depleted to fight it. The abuse erodes your sense of self. And over time, it starts to feel like there's no way out. You're stuck in something that hurts, but escape feels impossible. With the loss of your sense of self, your identity starts to revolve more and more around the abuser's needs and approval. Their constant criticism, manipulation, and assault on your self worth leave you feeling worthless, confused, and even crazy. And over time, you lose touch with your own desires, boundary, and sense of self. These trauma bonds become incredibly addictive, and you start to crave the brief moments of affection and validation, even as they're interspersed with pain, neglect, and cruelty. You hold on, hoping for a return to the warmth that hooked you in the beginning. The fear of abandonment, loss, or being alone keeps you clinging because part of you feels like you can't live without them. Understanding the stages of trauma bonding helps to expose the mechanics of that entanglement. It gives us a clear framework for recognizing what we're experiencing, why we stay stuck, and how these patterns keep us trapped in cycles of pain and longing. When we begin to see the patterns clearly, their grip starts to loosen. And that awareness often gives us the strength to reach out for the support we need, to break free and begin to rebuild and open ourselves to the possibility of a relationship that actually is safe, healthy, and fulfilling. Many of us struggle to understand what is it about these trauma bonds that make it so difficult to break free. Problem is that these trauma bonds can feel just as powerful and it's hard to break as an addiction. It's in many ways, it's not unlike the grip of opioids. Even when the harm is clear, the craving for that next hit of connection or validation keeps pulling you back. The emotional intensity of these relationships runs so deep that you find yourself staying tied to someone who just keeps hurting you, even when part of you knows you need to walk away. And no matter how much pain it causes, you keep going back, hoping for a shift that never comes. And that's because these trauma bonds are rooted in a survival response. Breaking free can feel like withdrawing from a drug. It activates terror, grief, guilt, and longing. And many of us stay stuck out of the fear of loss, of abandonment, of being alone, a low self worth, and even sometimes financial dependence. Many others don't even realize they're in a trauma bond. Again, this isn't about weakness or lack of willpower. It's about your entire system, your nervous system, your biochemistry, the deeper levels of your psyche. All these aspects of you are doing whatever it can to survive. You've become locked into a desperate struggle to get your most basic needs met, the need to love and to be loved, except that you're being repeatedly hurt, re traumatized, and it feels overwhelming and even inescapable at times. But this perpetual reenactment isn't healing. What may have served to protect you in response to past traumas or other adverse experiences at earlier times in your life can now keep you trapped in cycles of pain, confusion, and emotional dependency that prevent you from ever healing or moving forward. First step in breaking free from a trauma bond is recognizing that you're in one. And here are some of the most common signs to watch out for. You may feel intensely attracted to someone who mistreats you, even when they're not around. The fear of losing them can feel overwhelming. And you find yourself denying, downplaying, or making excuses for their abusive behavior, even when the damage is obvious. You feel trapped in the relationship, but terrified to leave, or of being abandoned. You keep longing for their approval, are those rare moments of affection, even though they regularly hurt or tear you down. You've become isolated from friends and family, and the abuser has become your main source of connection and support. The relationship moves in cycles, cruelty followed by affection, keeping you stuck in a loop of hope and disappointment. Your emotions are all over the place. You feel drawn to this person, even care about them. Maybe you feel you love them deeply, all the while feeling hurt, anxious, or afraid. It's a confusing mix of affection, fear, and loyalty that keeps you emotionally entangled. And you blame yourself for their behavior, believing that if you were better, they'd treat you differently. And it feels less like love and more like an addiction. You're strung out on that person like a drug addict needing their fix. But no matter how much it hurts, you can't seem to walk away. Freeing yourself from a trauma bond begins with seeing clearly what you've been caught in. Clarity often comes through self-discovery and a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play. And once you begin to recognize the patterns and how they've shaped your attachment, you could start taking steps to break free. And that's when true healing begins. Here are a few essential practices to help you navigate this painful but ultimately transformative experience. For so many of us, the process begins with educating ourselves by reading articles and books, watching videos to learn about trauma bonding, manipulation, and the cycle of abuse. It could also include having conversations with friends or a therapist or anyone who's had these kinds of experiences and trauma bonding in their own lives, which is, for that matter, much of the population. Create space between yourself and the person you've formed an attachment to, especially if the dynamic has become abusive. Go low or no contact if possible. Physical and emotional distance does help to bring clarity and allows you to step back and interrupt the cycle of emotional dependence and begin to reconnect with yourself. If you are in a toxic or abusive relationship and you sense a potential threat to your well-being, don't just walk away without a plan. Think it through. Make sure you're safe. If the person is unpredictable or volatile, wait until they're not around before making your exit. Reach out to people you trust and use a crisis line if needed. Ground yourself in the here and now. Acknowledge what you're feeling and recognize the behavior that's harming your well-being. And use whatever practices or therapeutic interventions to help you to reconnect with your body, become more present, and support your healing. Find support, whether it's through an understanding friend or family member or therapist, or join a support group and talk with other people who have had similar experiences who understand these kinds of relational dynamics. Repattern your inner model of relationships by surrounding yourselves with people who are emotionally consistent, grounded, safe, kind, caring, and empathetic. Learn what secure love feels like in your body. True repatterning happens through new experiences of connection and safety, especially with individuals who possess the capacity to love and be loved. Be compassionate with yourself and understand that healing often is a messy, nonlinear process. You're not to blame for the harm that was done to you. One of the things I've discovered is that by allowing yourself to be truly present, to face the reality that's playing out and feel your authentic feelings, you naturally become more compassionate and understanding towards yourself. Early experiences of abuse or dysfunction can shape us in ways we don't even realize. Without meaning to, we often end up drawn to the same kinds of emotional chaos we grew up with. We recreate the instability because, on some level, it feels familiar, even when it hurts. And over time, that familiarity hardens into a trauma bond, keeping us stuck in the same painful relationship cycles. Start by paying attention to the patterns that keep playing out in your relationships. Which trauma responses tend to take over? Do you shut down or chase after someone, freeze or fawn? When did you first start reacting this way? And what does it feel like in your body when it happens? One of the biggest reasons people stay stuck in trauma bonds is because they haven't processed their past relational trauma and the emotions attached to those experiences that are keeping them entangled. For most of us, our parents were doing the best they could with the tools and resources they had. But that doesn't mean that they weren't wounded themselves. And many of us grew up in homes where there was verbal, emotional, physical, or even sexual abuse, or some combination thereof. And that kind of upbringing makes us far more susceptible to trauma bonding. Even those of us who had relatively loving and supportive parents still fall into trauma bonds, especially with someone who has narcissistic traits. But for those of us who didn't grow up with a secure attachment, who never learned how to work constructively with our emotions, the risk is much higher. The unprocessed pain from childhood, often carried forward from our relationships with our parents, makes us more likely to repeat these same dynamics in adulthood. We find ourselves entangled with someone who might be narcissistic, emotionally volatile, or even struggling with borderline tendencies. Someone who criticizes, withdraws affection, or lashes out or creates chaos. And these behaviors trigger deep emotional responses in us: fear of loss, sadness, shame, confusion, and hurt. And because we never learned how to be present with those emotions or how to process them, we fall into the same patterns, denying what's happening. We distract ourselves, numb out, we pretend we're fine. Meanwhile, all that pain stays trapped in our body. It never gets metabolized. And the painful emotions, along with the imprint of past relational trauma, creates a holding pattern that keeps us stuck, entangled in relationships that hurt us and prevents us from breaking free, healing, and moving on. For the longest time, I was operating with these profoundly deep emotional deficits, and I wanted, in the worst way, to have someone in my life to love and to be loved. I kept trying to hold on to women who were disinterested, unavailable, abusive, and some were crazy making. I was so caught up in the hope that things could work out that I didn't want to see the truth of what was really happening in these relationships. I couldn't let myself feel what was really going on inside me either. And that disconnection from my own emotional reality only reinforced the trauma bonds that were causing so much suffering. It took time, but eventually I had to teach myself to come back to reality, to stop clinging to the fantasy and face what was actually happening. I had to allow myself to fully feel the sadness, the fear of abandonment, the pain of loss, the ache of knowing I would never get to share a real life with this person. It was excruciating at times, but allowing myself to feel the truth of it, that was the beginning of real healing. The critically important lesson here is this: if you're going to heal, you have to fully acknowledge the reality of what's happening with this person and allow yourself to feel what's actually coming up in response to it. That means letting go of the fantasy or the potential you once saw and coming face to face with the truth of the dynamic as it is right now. It's not easy, but there's no healing possible without this level of honesty. Like with so many other people, psychotherapy was a very important part of my healing journey. And it gave me a deeper understanding of my emotional wounding, helped me to make sense of the relational dynamics that I kept finding myself in. And in addition, I studied obsessively on my own because I wanted to fully grasp what was going on. And again, that was incredibly valuable to a certain point, but it wasn't actually healing the deep emotional wounds. For so many of us, these trauma bonds run extraordinarily deep and become hardwired into our physiology and psyche. We carry emotional wounds that go all the way back to childhood. And every painful relationship we've been in since had only exacerbated these wounds. I was in such an immense amount of pain and at the same time longing for someone I could love and be loved by. And that longing fueled my determination. I was willing to try anything, any practice or intervention that held real promise of helping me to heal. And people often say there are many paths to healing. And while there may be some truth to that, what I've seen over the years tells a different story. I've encountered so many people still carrying the wounds of childhood trauma, replaying these same patterns of pain and reenacting trauma bonds in their adult relationships. The scars, the emotional, energetic, and sometimes even physical, aren't always visible to others, yet they're unmistakable to me. And even though they may have progressed to some extent, I can still sense these deeply wounded aspects of themselves that have still not healed. Of all the therapeutic interventions that I've explored over the years, deep tissue bodywork has been enormously helpful. It brings more of the emotions that have been trapped in my body up to the surface so that I can actually process them. Also, during the sessions that I've done with gifted healers, I could feel the trauma I'd internalized, along with all the painful emotions from childhood and adolescence, the unhealthy attachments and the relationships that I'd gone through that had caused so much suffering. I could feel all that rising to the surface. And as that happened, I could feel the wounded parts of me beginning to heal and transform. The problem I ran into is that there were very few gifted healers at this time in history that I could go to or rely on to help me along my journey. More than anything, it was the Vision Quest, a traditional Native American healing practice that involved going out to fast alone in the mountains for 4 days and nights without food and water. That created the biggest shift for me. And there were times during this experience where I would feel this extraordinarily powerful presence descend into my body. There are moments where it would feel like a near death experience. I would have some of these early life traumas going back to childhood. In some instances, events or experiences I had either slight or no recollection of, and yet it would all be flooding back. And also some of the traumas around attachments I'd formed or some of the relationships that had occurred later down the road. But all this would be coming back, and I could feel myself going into this profoundly deep trance like state, reliving these past traumas and I could feel this presence working within my body. And I would be digesting these lived experiences and all the powerful emotions, this backlog emotion attached to those experiences. And while all this was happening, I could feel the same presence working within me to build this entirely new foundation. And as a result of developing this new foundation, as I'd come out the other side, I found that my relationships were improving, that I was letting go of, outgrowing those individuals that were in some way unhealthy or toxic, letting go of those destructive relationships, those individuals who were disinterested and unavailable or abusive or just not a good match. And as that happened, I found myself attracting to me individuals with whom I could establish or co-create more meaningful and more deeply fulfilling relationships. Now, having spent years training with a traditional Native American doctor, a medicine man from the Kiowa tribe, and a big part of the training that I'd go to, and my mentor would transmit portions of his healing gifts to me. And in order to earn the right to work with the gifts of healing he was transmitting to me, he had me go on the vision quest. Again, fasting the 4 days and nights without the food and water in order to earn the right to work with these, what they referred to as the medicine, these gifts that he was transmitting to me that had been passed down over hundreds of years. And because of this, I'm able to work as a conduit. I allow an extraordinarily powerful presence to work through me to facilitate healing within the bodies and minds of those I work with, healing of the trauma bonds and other deep emotional wounds, healing of the physical body, such as I work with a lot of people facilitating the healing of those with digestive disorders or those injured in automobile accidents, with heart disease, a wide range of issues. So if you feel ready to take that next step in your healing journey, you're willing to do what it takes to facilitate the healing of these trauma bonds and deep emotional wounds and your physical body as well, do reach out to me. I can be reached at 332 333 5155. Leave a message and I'll call you back. Again, the number is 332 333 5155. Thank you for taking time and listening to what I have to share today. Also, if you're seeing this video on YouTube, look for the link below. Read the article for anything I might have left out, and it will help you to internalize more of this message so that you gain a deeper understanding of trauma bonds and what it takes to truly heal.